Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Mike Evers. I've been on the faculty of the Hyman Center for 7.5 years now. All the cells in my body have changed since I first became involved with the Hyman Center. And what we're going to talk about, a little bit of background. I have been in fundraising for 30 years now, most of that time as a consultant to a whole variety of nonprofit organizations, though they do tend to be in the healthcare and social service fields. So what I'm about to share with you is basically the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of participating in and more commonly observing charitable solicitations, most desirably made by volunteers, and we'll explain why that's the case now. Before I begin on this talk, which is called Timeless Tips on How to Ask for Money, I want to state a limitation which I would call the John Wayne limitation. Some of you here may have seen it was John Wayne's last movie, I believe. It was called The Shootist. It's about John Wayne. He's a famous gunfighter. He's in his last days. He's dying of cancer. He's staying at a boarding house run by Lauren Bacall and her son, Opie, Ron Howard. And John Wayne and Opie go out back one day to shoot at bottles with their guns. And Opie observes that he's almost as good a shot as John Wayne is. And John Wayne pauses and looks at him and says, "It's different when you're shooting at people than at bottles." And that to some degree expresses the limitation of what we're going to discuss today. But I mentioned it at the beginning to emphasize that the best way to learn how to ask for money is to ask for money. Okay? We can role play and talk as much as we want, but it's ultimately no substitute for actually going out and asking for money. So what I would encourage you to do with what we've discussed today is think about trying it out as soon as you reasonably can. You obviously can't buttonhole people on the street and suddenly ask them for money for your cause. Just out of curiosity, if I could take a poll, how many of the people attending, if you know how to raise your hand using this device, could you indicate whether you are volunteers / trustees or staff people? I'd be curious to know the mix. Okay. Okay, well, I'm going to keep talking because we only have an hour. Okay? Thank you for that. Now, what I'd like to begin with, one of the things about asking for money is it seems very similar to other activities, and consequently, volunteers coming from those professional backgrounds, as well as staff people, tend to get a little bit confused because soliciting people for money is not the same thing as some of these other activities. So we're briefly going to review occupationally challenged solicitors and their problems. Now, attorneys, and frequently attorneys will be involved in fundraising activities, have their own set of problems. And what I mean by problems is not so much things they do wrong, but habits they bring with them from the way they do business as attorneys. One of the most common ones is they get the impression they're going to argue the case for the charity. Persuading people to make a gift, I would suggest, is a little bit different than that. By the time you've managed to get somebody to sit down and talk to you about a charity, I would say that 9 times out of 10, those people have already decided they want to do something, maybe for your charity, maybe for another. And this is really about knocking obstacles out of the way so that they can decide that your charity is the best one. It's not an argument. You're not going to overcome resistance in the sense of they think a completely different thing about your charity, at least not in terms of an individual solicitation. That's a process that will take quite a bit of time. The other thing that lawyers tend to do is they try to present the other side. Now, frankly, if I'm trying to raise money for very poor people in Central America, as among other things I've been doing for several decades now, I don't really want to argue the other side about why you shouldn't give money to the charity. We just want to persuade you to make the gift if you can be inclined to do that. Salespeople have a different set of problems, and I'm saying this so that those of you who wind up working with salespeople who are volunteers, as well as those of you who may be salespeople, they tend to make they present present two challenges in terms of fundraising. The first is that they tend to forget that donors don't have a compelling need to give in quite the same way that people have a compelling need to buy. For example, to take the case of the gentleman in the picture, if you're looking for a car, chances are you need a car. You may not need the car they're selling, but you need a car. Otherwise, I know very few people who go out shopping for cars just for fun instead of going to art museums or other activities. That's important. Donors don't have to do this. So the persuasion is a little bit different. And also, and I think it's partly because many salespeople are compensated on commission, they tend to resist a team approach. And in fundraising, a team approach can be very, very helpful. It's often good to have more than one person involved in a solicitation. And I find that sometimes people trained with a sales background have a little bit of resistance to that. Now, next we have stockbrokers. Okay, one of the issues that's involved with stockbrokering is that large amounts of money are transacted by phone. An enormous amount of business is done by phone. I do know people in the money management business that occasionally meet with their clients, but most of what they do, particularly the transactions, do not occur face-to-face. And sometimes it takes them a little while to grasp the importance of doing things face-to-face. In the age of email and all the other communications, well, frankly, I mean, I don't know about you, but I do a lot of conference calls with volunteers once we've had a chance to meet face-to-face and feel like we're part of a group. It's very tempting to try to be more efficient by using those modern communication techniques, but when you're asking for a significant gift from an individual, that's not a good idea. For the same reason that it's not a good idea to propose to somebody by email or fax. So you really ought to do that sort of thing face-to-face. Finally, and this is the most interesting group, are fundraisers. They confuse themselves with real people. Now, keep in mind the person who just said that has been a fundraiser for the last 30 years. Okay, that's not intended as a put-down. I frankly think that what we do is some of the most interesting work in the world, and what's great about it is you get such variety. But the fact is that when you are on the job, and this would be different if you were a volunteer for a charity that you're not employed at, you do not have the same persuasive power simply because you were on the payroll, so to speak. If you want to wonder what I'm talking about, then imagine that you were going shopping with a friend for clothing. And okay, I'm a guy too. That's a little harder for guys to figure out. But imagine it's happening anyway. Use your imagination. And now imagine you're trying on an outfit, a sports jacket, a dress, whatever, and you're standing in front of the mirror and you're trying to see how you look in this outfit, and you, at exactly the same moment, the salesperson and you, and your friend say, "That looks great on you." Now, it is possible that your friend is notorious for their complete and utter lack of style and taste in clothing, but with that qualifier aside, the reality is that what your friend, your peer, and that's a key term in fundraising, your peer says to you is going to carry more weight than what the professional salesperson. Now, it doesn't mean the salesperson is going to pick out stuff that's bad for you. There are, those of you who buy clothes at the same stores regularly know that there are salespeople still who you depend on for their taste. But the reality is that anything coming from somebody who is not paid to do it is going to have more credibility. And it's important for fundraisers to realize that. Even though you may know more about the charity, you need to let the volunteer, whenever possible, take the lead. That's not always possible. The volunteer may become tongue-tied, and it's good for you to be there with them, unless it's a really, really high-level event, and even then sometimes it's useful. But to remember that you are, I like to refer to myself as the help. I'll occasionally show up at a meeting and I will be wearing a tie and everybody else will be not wearing a tie, or whatever the equivalent is in women's attire. And they'll say, "Gee, you didn't have to get all dressed up." And I don't say this to them as in, "Gee, I really did have to get all dressed up." Rather, I'll just tell them the help always wears a uniform. And while, that's a little bit of an act of humility. I think it makes people more effective as fundraisers if they recognize their role that way. Or to quote the immortal Naomi Levine, never think you're one of them. Because when you are on the job, you're not. You're on the job. Okay? So having dispatched with occupational hazards, let's get to the two key concepts of learning how to be really good at raising money, particularly if you're really good at other things and you assume those skills will transfer. The first key concept is Socratic ignorance, okay? That knowledge that comes from recognizing that you know that there's stuff you don't know. If you assume that mental attitude when learning about raising money and soliciting gifts, I think you will learn stuff, because some of what we're going to talk about is a little bit counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense at first, but if you keep an open mind, I think you will really benefit. Now, key concept number two is a quote from a gentleman named John Dolan, who for many, many years was one of the great eminences in fundraising. His principal place that he worked was the old St. Vincent's Medical Center, and he moved on from there many, many decades before it ran into trouble. But he said his father was fond of telling him that patience and perseverance made a bishop of his reverence. And what he meant by that was simply that repetition at the proper intensity is critical to getting large gifts, critical to getting a lot of things done when you are working with volunteers, which is to say real people. Okay, keep in mind that volunteers, by definition, this is not their job. That's why we call them volunteers. And that means that when you're trying to get the assistance of a real person to help you raise money, you need to recognize that if you are item number 5 on the to-do list for the day, you're having a good day, because they have jobs, they have family matters, they may have other charitable priorities. So it's important to remember gentle patience and perseverance is really a key to this whole thing. Now, what we're going to do is discuss the linear version of how to ask for a gift. And then we're going to talk about the nonlinear features of it, because frankly, if asking for a gift were as simple as going through this 8-step process, then fundraisers who are now currently, I'm calling them not real people, would all have cars and drivers waiting outside, because if this is all you had to do, it would be much easier to raise money. Okay? The first thing you need to do is to set up a meeting, and I say to talk about the campaign. And we'll talk about why you're not going to call later on, why you're not going to call them and say, I'm going to talk to you about making a gift to this project. You may even want to just call them up and talk to them about the charity. I like to use the word the campaign or annual appeal or whatever, whatever's most appropriate, simply because you don't want to be sneaky and arrange to meet with them, and then they're suddenly surprised that fundraising is part of the discussion. That doesn't work very well. Whenever possible, you want to meet with these individuals in person. Now, sometimes, believe it or not, I remember once talking to a gentleman who wanted to give $7,500 to name a bay in an emergency room. Very busy lawyer, and he basically said he'd make the gift on the understanding that he didn't have to take a site tour and he didn't have to meet with anybody. And I think that was, people can argue that you should have held out and gotten more, but I don't think so. I think the deal was he's going to give us $7,500 or he's going to go away. You don't want to let meeting with the person become an obstacle. But whenever possible, that is the best thing to do. When you meet with them, ask them for a specific gift. Okay, most people don't want to say no. They want to do what you want them to do, but they kind of need guidance. If you just ask for a gift or would really appreciate your support, you don't tell people what they want, what you want them to do. I remember once years ago looking at a house that people had on the market themselves, and it was a nice house, and I asked them what they wanted for it, and they didn't have a number. So I had no idea what I couldn't do anything with it. Okay, so ask for a specific gift. The other reason you want to do that is if you don't, then whatever charitable decision the donor makes, it will be measured up from 0, either consciously or unconsciously. Whereas whatever number you ask them for, even if it's not what they ultimately decide to give you, they will be measuring from that number, and that's important. Okay, it will produce much better results. If they want to think about the gift, then you got to, I mean, it's not unreasonable. If you ask somebody for $50,000, or more precisely, your solicitation team does that, preferably headed by a peer of the prospect, and that peer is meaningful to that prospect. They might want to think about it. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I'd want to come home and say, my wife asked me what happened today, and I say, honey, I just pledged $25,000 or $50,000 or whatever. If it's more than $100, let's say, without discussing it with you, I think she'd be kind of mad. So it's reasonable for people to want to think about it. And think about it often means talk to your spouse if these people are married or have partners. Okay? They want to think about it, say you set up a follow-up time. You say, well, okay, how about I call you in 2 weeks? Is that too soon? And less than 2 weeks is usually too soon. Okay? You don't want to pressure people. Okay? But it's critical if they say yeah. And actually, you don't want to say, can I call to follow up? You want to ask it as an open-ended question. Or when can I follow up? Is 2 weeks okay? And if they say 2 weeks is too soon because they're going to the coronation at Buckingham Palace or something, that's fine, but the negotiation is now when you're going to follow up, not whether you're going to follow up. Sometimes people say, well, don't worry, I'll get back, I'll call you. What that means is wait 3 weeks because they're not going to call you. Or if they do, it's unusual. And call them after 3 weeks and say, hey, I haven't heard from you. Okay? But when you set the date to follow up, it is critical that you actually follow up on that day. Okay? The reason for it is, number 6, if they haven't made a decision, you should set up another follow-up time using the same approach. Again, follow up when you say you will, and as I say here, grow old together in this way. Now, this does not always happen. Sometimes you make the solicitation, you get the number right away. All right? If that's the case, then you can skip all the other steps and move on to the next solicitation. But the reality is, many solicitations, they want to think about it. And there is inertia. And you're just trying to overcome it. And if you think I'm kidding, imagine the number of things in your own life that you've been meaning to get to for years, and you haven't gotten around to it. And those aren't ones that involve giving away your money. Okay? So it's not uncommon for people to take a while to come to a decision, particularly if it's a larger number. The reason you always want to follow up when you say you will is that the prospect realizes that they ought to make a decision one way or the other, preferably the way you want them to. And eventually the news that you are going to be calling in 3 weeks or whatever begins to hang like a big psychological deadline, and it's frequently what gets them off the mark. I mean, imagine, prospect sitting there with her husband, it's Sunday night, they're watching TV, everything's wonderful. Does she really want to bring up the subject of how, we'd like to, I'm thinking of giving away $25,000 of the family exchequer, is that okay? And ruin the whole mood. But the fact that she knows that you are calling her tomorrow, because you always call when you say you will often get her off the mark. And that's really important. Now, this is the simple way. I could write a simple list for doing anything, how to propose to somebody to marry them, how to ask somebody for a date, how to be available for a date. As with the John Wayne example at the beginning, these are all intellectually easy to understand, but they're not the same thing as doing it live with real people. And that gets us to the nonlinear features of fundraising. And it's important to think of these, think of them as affirmations, that as you try to implement that 8-step plan I just laid out for you, these issues are going to come up, and you can remember that you were warned about them, that they will exist. Okay, and in many ways I find these are much more important than the linear aspects, other than the understanding of following up and doing it with the right intensity, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. First and foremost, you are not alone in your aversion. Most people don't like soliciting gifts. Some people say they do, but they usually don't unless somebody asks them to do it. I like to think that people go out and ask for money from other people for the same reason that they do things like go to their kids' band concerts. Okay, I know that some people love that. I mean, I'm glad to do it. I have children, but it's not the thing I most look forward to in a month is I'm going to watch my kid's band concert or whatever school activity is going on. Maybe I'm unique in that way, but I suspect that I'm not. All right. Next. Make your own gift first. Hopefully you've heard this before, but this is critical. The volunteers out there, please note this is not just a slick sales pitch on the part of the fundraising professionals working with you to get your gift. You have much more credibility if you have already made a gift. Ideally, it's a gift as large or larger than the gift that you're asking from the prospect. Not everybody can do that, and frankly, I know there are some schools of thought that say you should only do that, but in the real world of smaller and mid-sized organizations in particular, you don't always have that luxury. And even at very large institutions, if you're looking for a $100 million gift, you may not have a surplus of people with the right personalities and connections on your board who have also made a $100 million gift. All right, but you should make a gift that is as I like to put it, personally significant. Think in terms of the metaphor of the widow's mite with appropriate adjustments for the changes in the consumer price index since the first century of the Common Era. It needs to be a gift that shows that you are committed. And if you haven't done that, you have to really think about what would happen. You're asking a person to make a generous gift to the charity. And frankly, if it isn't a generous gift, then you could have probably done it by sending them a letter. Or it should be large enough that it merits a face-to-face meeting. And that person turns around and asks you, how much are you giving? That's crunch time. You're showing that you're not just talking the talk, you're walking the walk as well. So it should be a meaningful gift. I mean, if you're talking to a hedge fund manager and you are a teacher at a private school, your gift, the size of your gift is going to be measured by the hedge fund manager based on the fact that you work at a private school. That's understood, but you have to make your own gift first. It is the most decisive thing. And in fact, for those professionals out there, I would strongly recommend you never let volunteers go out and ask other people for money until they've made that gift first. It's a critical discipline. And frankly, it helps get the ball rolling. If anybody has any questions, we're going to have time at the end of the session. I'll ask you to hold them for that. Concept, timeless tip number 2. You are one of the good guys. It never ceases to amaze me how many people apologize because they have the temerity to go out and ask people for a gift, for a charity. I mean, that is some nerve. People are starving in sub-Saharan Africa, and you want to help them? And you want to help them by asking me to help them too? You have some nerve. I mean, who are you? Okay, but so often people forget. They feel really embarrassed that they have to ask you for money. It's important that you internalize the fact that you are being a good guy, or a good person, I should say. You are being a good person. You're trying to alleviate suffering, advance human well-being, and it's important to internalize that idea because it will show through. There have been studies done in sales that people have a really positive attitude going into a meeting. Don't ask me how they measure that, but there are such studies. They do better. They can statistically demonstrate they do better. So you got to remember you're one of the good guys. All right, now. Next, ask in person. Now, we've discussed that sometimes that can be an obstacle, but I cannot overemphasize the importance of asking in person. As Benjamin Franklin, who among other things was a very successful philanthropist in his time, he used to say, if you want it done, go yourself. Okay? The sheer fact that you showed up, that you said, this is important enough for me to go out and meet with you, and it's important enough for me to ask you to interrupt your busy schedule, to sit down and talk to me, and hopefully me is in the plural, that says more than anything that's going to come out of your mouth afterwards. Okay? That conveys that it's important. Fundraising, and again, this may be a little bit counterintuitive, there's a lot about what's not said, the actions you take. We know that you're not alone in your aversion. You probably don't like asking people for money, and yet you're taking time out of your busy day to talk to me about making a gift to this charity. That says something about its importance. Okay, now sometimes you can't get a meeting, but the sheer threat, so to speak, of offering to meet with them conveys that importance, and it's really irreplaceable. Okay? Set a meeting. Now, you may wonder, how is this Isn't this a little bit redundant from what I just said? It's a little bit of a continuation, but there are certain details that it is important to focus on. As I said, a large gift is important, and it's an important enough issue to set up a specific meeting to talk about it. The reason I emphasize this is a common, particularly with volunteers, a common technique they have is to try to wedge it in. I'm going to be seeing Biff at the country club. You don't want to do that. And the reason you don't want to do that is when you ask somebody for a specific amount, as we'll talk about in a little bit, quite frequently there's a reflexive reaction to say no. I don't know why, but I've seen it many, many times. And it doesn't mean they're not going to make a gift. It's just a reflex. All right, you know, it's not a lot different than if there's a loud noise, so people turn and look. If you're interrupted by Charlie, who wants to come up and doesn't know that you and Biff are talking about making a significant gift to a charity, the conversation gets prematurely interrupted, and the last you left them with was, he said no. It's awkward to resume the conversation. I have found, I always found this to be the case, eating establishments are an excellent place, or any place where you have sort of a captive audience. If you're in that person's office, an important client can come and call in and interrupt them. It's a bit much, if you're really powerful. I once had a fundraising mentor who defined the difference between influence and clout this way. An influential person can say, I would like to come see you, and you'll say, sure, come on by. A person with real clout can say, I'd like you to come see me, and you'll show up. So unless you have clout and can draw them to your lair, a restaurant is a good place to have a major solicitation. The reason for it is you're kind of captive. It's very rude to get up and run out of a restaurant before the meal is over. It's also still in this day of cell phones and constant interruption considered rude to answer the phone at the table. And the whole point here is to find a place where you're going to get the minimum amount of distraction. So if you don't know where to go to a restaurant. Just keep in mind that Starbucks with everybody screaming and yelling is not what we're talking about. A restaurant where it's quiet. Okay? Now, no violence. This may sound ridiculous, but it's not. Okay, the number of words, some of them are listed on the screen. I've come here to twist your arm for charity X, or I'm going to shake you down, I'm going to hit you up, I'm going to put the bite on you. I have no idea why all these violence-related terms have been attached to asking people for money, but they have. I have seen people do this, and you can watch the body language on the other people, and it changes. You don't want people being put in a position where they're making a gift in any way, shape, or form feels like they are submitting to your will. It's not a good way to do it. There's this sort of macho notion, and I can't think I've ever heard of this from a female volunteer or professional. They like to say, you ask for the money, and whoever talks next loses. I mean, if you're gonna frame a charitable solicitation in those kind of win-lose terms, then it's not going to be a good charitable solicitation. And maybe you'll badger one gift out of this person, but you won't get any more. And as most of you, I hope, know, in fundraising, it's the repeat donors, the lifetime donations that matter to a large degree. And you don't want to mess that up by engaging in strange acts of aggression. And you may laugh, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen volunteers make this mistake. Don't force a trial close. Now, I suspect that some of you, if you have a sales background, know what a trial close is, but in case you don't, let's say you were buying a car and the customer isn't exactly, well, you're the salesperson, the customer isn't exactly, they haven't said they're going to buy it yet. So what you do is you might ask them something like, would you want one of these in green or in blue? In other words, you're not asking them to say, yes, I want to buy the car, but you're sort of getting them to make decisions about what you hope is their eventual purchase. And that's a trial close. All right. What I mean by that in terms of fundraising, and we mentioned this in the linear section as well, is don't call somebody and say, we want to meet, or if you're a fundraising staff person, you're calling on behalf of somebody. I find that's a very effective thing to do. Susan and Mr. Gotrocks would like to meet with you about, the campaign. All right? You don't want to put people in a position where they feel that agreeing to meet with you means they are agreeing to make a gift. And the reason for that is that the thing people dislike most in the world, in my opinion at least, is to say no. People will go to extraordinary lengths not to say no, okay? And you don't want to put people in a position where they're afraid they may have to say no prematurely, and particularly in a position where they're going to have to say no at a meeting where it's been assumed they're going to say yes. So you want to talk about, they want to meet about the campaign. Sometimes I set up a lot of these events, you'll get a response, you're going to ask me for a gift, right? Or you're going to expect me to give. And the answer I find is useful to getting over that resistance is to say, well, no, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about, hopefully make a contribution, but the idea here is for you to learn about what we're talking about. We're not assuming that you're going to make a decision. And that may be counterintuitive because in theory, if you're a twist the arm kind of fundraiser, you want to pin the person down and make them cough up the money. But that gets them to the table, and if they're at the table, you can talk to them, and once you can talk to them, you have a much better shot at actually getting support. Okay? Now, when you meet with people, I recommend getting to the point as quickly as possible. Okay? Now, what I mean by that is saying, Charlie, the reason we're hoping, we brought you because we were hoping you could think about, making a $15,000 gift to the campaign. Okay, now, obviously, you want to sit down, maybe let drinks show up, but the point is not to drag through the entire encounter without getting to the point. And this happens a lot. And what happens in those situations is that the prospective donor is always on the edge of their seat waiting for the shoe to drop. They want to know how much money you want them to give. They really do. They're almost afraid to laugh at your jokes because they'll feel you're leading them on. Okay, so I would, you have to, as I once explained to a teenager I met who interrupted a lot. He's a very talented pianist. So what I said to him is think of it as what happens when you need to come in on your part. You're playing a piece. You got to use feel for this. But as early as you can, ask for the money. They may say, that's impossible. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to give that amount. In fact, they say that quite frequently. And I mean, obviously, if they're drinking coffee and they spit it across the table, you may have asked for too much. But that's very common, and my suggested answer to that is to say, well, don't make a decision right now. We told you we didn't need you to make a decision right now. Let's just talk about what we're here to talk about, what this charity is going to do with your money. And the advantage of that is they know the worst case, which is, obviously you're not asking them to give even more money than you've already asked for. But now they're going to hear what you have to say about the charity without waiting for the other shoe to drop. I find this works very, very well. Now, sometimes they just say, sure, and you can still talk about the charity after that. If they want to give you the money right away, don't refuse to accept it. And insist that they hear the whole presentation. You want to stop talking when you made the sale, but get it out quickly. It makes it much easier. It makes everybody much more comfortable, particularly if you reassure them that you're not expecting a yes or no by the end of the meeting. Give them a vision. When I teach classes at the Hyman Center, I teach a class that involves working with very small charities. When you ask them what they do, they always talk about what they do. And what they really should be doing is talking about the vision, enabling people to see who they help. And when you ask somebody for this gift, you've now asked so-and-so for 15 grand, what are you going to do with the money? Well, if you're going to talk about bricks and mortar, or you're going to talk about a program, that's nice, but always express it in terms of how people are being helped, okay? As the example on the screen says, you can talk in detail about shipping rice to some place where people are starving, or you could talk about helping the children. And I assure you that is a much more exciting prospect for the donor than the details. You will occasionally get people who are into the details because that's what they're into. Don't steer them away. If that's how if that's the direction their desire runs, terrific. If you're building a vocational rehab program and they want to talk about machines, talk about machines. But the point is, what you really want them to see in that case, for example, would be the individuals with disabilities learning to, develop skills because of the rehab center. So I have to drag these screens down. I hope I do this right. Oh, this is really great. Okay. Next. Tell them what their perceived peers are doing. Now, get permission before you do this. But my favorite example of this are two gentlemen out golfing. One guy's been tasked with soliciting the other one. Golf, I don't golf, I do golf very badly. But if you golf or your volunteers golf, that's another good place to ask people for money. I remember going out on a golf course with one gentleman once. He turned to a very sophisticated philanthropist. He said, "No discussion of charity until the 12th hole," okay? And that was fine. That works very well. These two gentlemen were golfing, and let's say it was around the 12th hole. The one gentleman says to the other, I'm supposed to ask you about a gift for this project. And the other guy goes, "Well, how much?" And he goes, "Well, we were hoping you'd give 15. And the guy goes, "You should give 15. And so the solicitor was able to say, "I already have given 15. And so the other gentleman complied immediately. All right. Again, the power of giving first, but they were peers. But again, if you're telling other people are giving to this project in the range that you're talking, not the specific amount, but there are other folks giving gifts like this. That's a good way to say it, gifts like this. But only do that if you have the permission of the peers. Don't be giving out donor information. People often don't like that. But if they're willing to do it, it can be very, very helpful in terms of encouraging people. Now, when in doubt, ask for the largest amount. Yeah, that's John D. Rockefeller on the screen there, by the way. He has a famous quote where he said he was never offended when people asked him to give more than he intended to give. All right, and that's, within limits. That's a reasonable supposition. If you don't know whether to ask somebody for 50,000 or 100,000 or even 5 or 10,000, ask them for the larger amount. Just don't ask for a ridiculously large amount. You don't want to have that thing happen where, I'm thinking of electronic equipment where those little meter dials go all the way over to the left. If it's a ridiculously larger amount, then you lose credibility. But, if you're looking at an educated range, pick the larger amount. Where do you get the educated range? A little bit beyond the purview of this presentation, but it's called rating, and commonly you depend on research or you depend on, if it's a small organization, the opinion of the individual's peers. Always go with the larger amount as long as it's reasonable. If it's a large gift, again, let them think about it, okay? It's perfectly reasonable. Don't be put off by this. Now there is a comment where people say, "I got to talk to my accountant." In my experience, that's doom. That's a way of saying, "I don't really want to make this gift, or I'm going to make a much smaller gift." Who talks to their accountant about what they want to do? All right. But other than that, let them think about it. Don't try to pressure them. Okay. Just make sure that when you're done with that, when they think about it, that you will call them. In the event that they insist that they're going to call you, as I said, wait 3 weeks and call them to see what's up. Not, "Why haven't you gotten back to me?" I just felt like, you might even say, "This works well. I kind of felt obligated to call you because I hadn't heard from you and I didn't want you to think that we'd forgotten about you." All right? Now, never leave the pledge form. If you've got a pledge form, in fact, I don't even bring pledge forms and instruct volunteers not to bring them. If somebody wants to think about a gift, let them think about it and tell the peer what they're going to give. Okay, that will tend to elevate the gift or get you something. If you leave the pledge form, they fill it out and mail it back to you, and you can't go back and say, "I'm very sorry, this is not nearly enough money." You just need to wait for the next giving cycle. So you want to avoid preemptive gifts of that kind. And sometimes people do send preemptive gifts. A very billionaire I was doing a study with letter went out to him. He sent in a check for $5,000, said, "This is as much as I want to be involved with." And while that's an interesting fundraising strategy, that was his way of saying, "I don't want to give more to this charity," which is to be respected with many charities. Follow up when you say you will. Okay, it is, as I said, really important to set that. It says that you care about this. It says that this is an important activity. And again, it provides that driver that there's a deadline. It's sort of a strange deadline. It's a deadline that involves peer pressure. You're not asking them to be unreasonable. You're just asking them to make a decision. That's very different than saying, "I'm going to call you in a week and you better have 10 grand ready for me." That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you need to follow up when you say you will, okay, because that will drive the the decision. And a lot of times the decision is just a matter of inertia. And if you doubt that, think of all the wonderful things you've wanted to do in your life, all the conversations you've had about people should get together and do something. And yet, you know, some people occasionally do. They found nonprofit organizations to do those things, or they find an organization and they sponsor a project. But I'd say that 99% of those ideas never reach fruition for similar reasons of inertia. Time is not your friend, okay? And if you doubt that, imagine that somebody asked you to make a significant gift 4 months ago, and you got a phone call, and it was the same person saying, oh yeah, I just thought I'd call to follow up on that gift that I'd asked you about 4 months ago. Well, it's not a deal killer that you waited 4 months to follow up, but just as showing up in person or threatening to show up in person conveys that you think this is important, taking that long to follow up sends a terrible message to the prospect. Well, maybe terrible isn't the word, but it conveys an attitude that this isn't really that urgent or important. You know, it's not your. The longer you wait, as long as you're not badgering the person, the less it's not good for you. Okay. Now, that said, and this is critical, I find, do not become a pain in the ass. All right. It's wonderful, okay, that you want to do this. You are one of the good guys. The cause is worthy. Everything you're doing is terrific. But the reality is that this is not necessarily the center of the prospective donor's universe. I know a story of it was a gentleman in New Jersey, big developer of affordable housing. He was ambushed in the parking lot once by the founder of an organization, okay? He didn't really want to be ambushed in the parking lot of his apartment building where he lived by this person. It did not make him want to give more money to that charity. The most extreme example of this that I've ever recorded in my experience, and she didn't know what she was doing. I mean, she realized it was unreasonable when I pointed it out to her. So working with a charity, and there was a family we'd had on the radar as potential major donors for a building campaign. And one of them passed away. And here I have the executive director of this charity suggesting that maybe we should go talk to them about a memorial gift. Okay, now they just lost a loved one. And as I pointed out to her, and I won't mention names to embarrass that person, maybe we should at least wait till after the burial. What do you think? The point is that there are ways of doing this to become rude and intrusive, okay? And you do not want to be thought of the way that those people that tend to be raising money for police-related charities who get on the phone and won't get off the phone. You don't want to convey that impression. You need to respect the fact that they're busy. For example, if I know somebody's on vacation, in fact, there's a rule I try not to call volunteers on Mondays, because I assume they get back to the office, they got stuff to deal with before their charity stuff. If I know somebody's been on a trip, I don't want to call them until they've been home for a few days, unless you're the kind of person that, you know, is in the office maybe once a week. In fact, when you're dealing with people like that and they have assistants whose job is to keep you away from them, and I tell them that, well, I'll wait a few days till they've had a chance to clear off their desk, the positive reception you get from that is really quite extraordinary. For another example, there are executives, a lot of them in the financial services industry, who get into the office at 6 in the morning, okay? I can assure you they did not get into the office at 6 in the morning so they could talk to you about a gift, all right? So it's important. Buddhism, interestingly enough, has an excellent concept called right effort, right everything. The idea here is to be persistent, but to be right persistent, to make effort, to make the right amount of effort. Don't push too hard any more than you want to be not persistent enough. Now, briefly, I have found over time certain universal objections. Okay? What happens, shocker of shockers, if you ask the donor for money, and instead of giving you money, They say they want to think about it, or they actually may object in certain ways. Some of them are very specific. I hate the executive director for what he did to my children, and I never want to give money to this charity. Well, that's not a universal objection. That's a specific one. I think what you were doing is wrong. Okay, that's a specific one. But there are certain universal ones that it's worth knowing what they look like so that you can figure out how to respond to. The first one I describe is we're a little bit tight right now because we just bought a Rolls Royce. And you'll hear stuff like this. People will describe, they just spent $250,000 renovating their house. They're well-to-do individuals, and what they're really saying to you is not, in fact, my favorite one was people explain that they just bought their daughter a second horse. I thought that was really very telling. They're not really saying that you asked them for too much money, okay? What they're saying is that they have a cash flow issue. Okay, just because people are wealthy doesn't mean they're liquid all the time. Even the wealthiest people go through periods when they aren't liquid. There's a very famous story, in fact, of a very well-to-do developer. A relative of his went to a casino that person owned and lost $1 million. This could be apocryphal, but this is a story I've been told. And that was a way of getting money because they just needed cash quickly. This happened many years ago. What you do with people like that is you talk about payment terms. Okay, well, you can give it over several years. If you don't want, if it's easier for you to make the payment early next year, that's fine. And one of the reasons to say that, by the way, is there's many people who have bonus structure, compensation and bonus that involve bonuses that frankly represent the majority of their annual income. It may be more convenient for them, but they'll be put off if they start talking about really big ticket items and they're still talking to you and they agree to meet with you. Chances are they want to make a gift, but you just need to work out how they can do it. Next, how dare you? Most people do not get upset when you ask them for a gift. Once in a while, somebody does. I'm not going to, sugarcoat it. I hope that doesn't scare away volunteers. But the fact is that not everybody is going to weep with joy at the news that you're asking them for a donation. But if they've agreed to meet with you, you have to ask yourself, this person agreed to meet with me to talk about a charity, and I've not hidden the fact that this involves raising money. What are they really upset about? Did I ask them for a donation? Well, if you didn't bother to let them know that this was in some way involved in fundraising, well, then they do have a right to get upset. So you should never sneak in on them. But more often than not, since they've agreed to talk to you, and they obviously want to say yes to you in some way, what are they upset about? And what they're upset about is you asked them for more money than they can comfortably afford, than they wanted to give, than they had in mind, and now they feel bad, okay? And some people, when they feel bad, they take it out on the people around them. This isn't a lost solicitation by any means. What it means is you have to get them from feeling bad to feeling good. And that's not, that doesn't involve saying something like, well, if you're so cheap you can't give this amount, we'll take a smaller gift. I mean, it's a gift. They don't have to give you anything, okay? But part of it also has to do with pride. They're not rich enough, or for whatever reason, they don't have enough money to do this. Okay, so what you do is, first of all, you apologize, and since the amount you're asking for, sometimes they'll ask, who came up with that number? There's a committee. Ratings are usually done by committee, and you apologize and say, you're sorry, we screwed up, okay? Then you can suggest that, hey, we're happy to give, we're happy with whatever you can give, but you want to go beyond that, and you want to identify amounts. And what you're doing conveniently, a little bit indirectly, is telling them that, we asked you for 25 grand, and that's way too much money. Obviously, you're upset at us, okay? A couple of people, some people give them 5, some people give them 10. We're happy with any gift that you can give us. We really appreciate it. But the fact is, I've asked you for a range of gifts there, haven't I? I've changed the benchmark from 25 to between 5 and 10. You don't want to keep pressuring them. This is not like, you know, $1,000 by $1,000, you work your way down. You give them a lower amount, and then you get back to them because they're going to think about it. And when you get back to them, you say, hey, I'm sorry, I guess we were just being more optimistic than reason allowed. Is that okay? Because you want to save this person's pride because, again, you may have a relationship with this donor for a long time, and you don't want to prematurely ruin it by making them feel bad. Almost to the end, then I'll have questions. Now, there are certain people, I find these people to be some of the most fascinating donors. They really want to make a gift. They really do. But they just, I mean, maybe it's the same people that, you know, live with somebody for 15 years and never decide to get married because of commitment issues. I don't really know. But they have a hard time making a commitment. Maybe it's because it's the first time they've made a large gift. They've always pictured large gifts being made by people wearing top hats and riding in horse-drawn carriages. They don't see themselves as the kind of people who would make this gift. I don't know. And I distinguish this from somebody who has a legitimate issue for not making a gift. I once had a surgeon tell me that he wanted to make a generous gift to a charity. I was doing a study where I was interviewing prospective donors. And he said, but I have a judgment from the IRS for $350,000, and until that gets sorted out, I can't really make a decision. Okay, that's not a procrastinator. That's somebody who has a legitimate issue, and that's what they got to do. Okay, in this case, they just can't get around to it. And you've asked them several times, and you know it's stretching out. It's 10, 12 weeks, and it becomes quite clear that it's not that they don't want to make a gift; they just don't seem to be able to make the decision. And you've established that it isn't that they're waiting for their spouse or their partner to come back, or that there's some event that needs to occur. At that point, ask them, I'm really feeling a little bit bad, and that interestingly gives you psychological leverage because they're going to feel bad that you feel bad because their procrastination is what made you feel bad. I'm really feeling like I'm bothering you, okay? Is this something you want to pass on? And they will 90% of the time say, no, I want to make a gift. At that point, okay, that's the moment when you say, make an educated guess, is 5,000 okay, or whatever the number is 10,000, whatever that number is, and that will 9 out of 10 times get them off the mark. And then you thank them profusely. And by the way, in fact, no matter what amount of money anybody gives you, always thank them profusely. You want them to feel good. Now, the last one, should understand that fundraising is an optimistic activity. The belief is people will give money. Not everybody will, but enough people will. And the amazing nonprofit organization network across the United States that all the world is looking to now is the American model of philanthropy is based on optimism. That said, there is this type of prospective donor I've run into. I call him Proteus, after the Greek god who used to sleep by the seashore, and what would happen is an ancient Greek would sneak up to him and grab onto him, and what Proteus would try to do is change into all sorts of different shapes, okay? And hopefully you would get so scared you'd let go and Proteus didn't have to tell you what you wanted to hear. If you hung on long enough, you got the results. Now, there are donors like this. They have a reason that they are not going to give to your charity, and they are never going to tell you what it is. It could be some personal slight they experienced, some dark secret from their past, or something that you would consider remarkably trivial, but they obviously don't. But it is something they are never going to say to you, all right? It may be something as simple as they have profoundly different beliefs than you about this topic. And in keeping with that notion that at cocktail parties you don't discuss religion or politics, they're just not going to say it. It may just be politeness, but something's going to happen. The way you can tell that you're dealing with Proteus is they will give an objection. Get an answer to that objection. I had a gentleman once say that I can't support an organization that gave an award to this person. I was able to find out that they didn't, in fact, give an award to that person. And then the prospective donor came up with another reason. And after 2 or 3 reasons that seemed to be just popping out of the air. Not educated questions where they want you to eliminate doubts and they're moving forward, and you'll be able to tell the difference. You need to recognize that this is Proteus, and you don't want to follow up with him 8 times. That's the bromide in sales, that 80% of all sales activity takes place after the 8th contact. Those numbers are suspiciously symmetrical to me, but the meaning behind it is true. You need to recognize that there will be Proteuses like this. As development staff, you need to be very attentive to this, because you do not want your volunteers, your real people, who are ideally doing most of the soliciting, damaged by people like Proteus, because they can waste a lot of time. Okay, well, I thank you all for still being here at the end of the talk, and I'll see if I can answer some of these questions. Are there any questions? There must be questions. Okay. All right. This is your chance. Does anybody have a question? Okay, well, I will fill in the airspace while waiting for questions by describing one thing that almost never happens, but I can tell you that I've seen it happen. And that goes back to this asking for a specific amount, which is, I find an area that the volunteers in particular have a real resistance to. Oh, okay. Thank you, Kayla. Kayla's question is, do you have any suggestions in maintaining contact/relationships in between asks? This is really critical. This is the area of stewardship, okay? You need to ask people. You need to make people feel appreciated in their gifts. I once, in fact, watched a very successful capital campaign end with the chairman forgetting to thank the major gifts chairman, and that's the last we heard of the major gifts chairman. It was at a big event, and he was sort of snubbed. The way you do it is you simply send them stuff, not a lot of stuff. You know, it's nice if you know their birthday. You want to. I have a very good approach, I think, that I do with one charity. We make these cheesy videotapes every year holiday season to show them just up close and personal. This is an organization that deals with people with intellectual disabilities. So I go and, go to the workshop, interview some of the workers. It's 5 or 6 minutes long, send it out to them by YouTube these days. They love it. The thing I would say is the less canned and prepackaged the contact, the better. Even though I send out the same cheesy video to 30 or 40 top donors, they all love it because it's cheesy. Okay. Do you have any suggestions for the universal objection for corporate or foundation giving? That's kind of I teach an entire course on this topic. The thing to remember with corporations and foundations is that in addition to the fact that they are making human decisions, all right, they're basically a group of people making a decision. In many cases, there are policy issues as well. I would say the CEO of a large company, let's say, tell us to ask the corporate giving office for $300,000 for this charity. And the president and I walked out, and we felt awfully good about that meeting. And it was eventually talked down to $50,000 by the corporate staff. And the reason for it wasn't so much an objection is this is public money. There were policies, and the CEO simply had forgotten about that fact. I like to think because we were so persuasive. The key thing to remember with objections there, all right, the responses I've given you do work for them. But you need to remember that there's another dimension there called policy, which if individuals have policies, they can change them. But corporations and foundations can't because they're often collective decisions. How do you get someone to agree? I hope I'm answering these questions properly. This is kind of a format I'm not totally used to yet. Elizabeth asks, how do you get someone to agree to meet with you and not talk over the phone? Well, there's a couple of ways to do that. One is just to say, we'd like to come see you. All right. Some people will say no, but people don't like saying no. If a peer is calling, that's better. I mean, given the choice of the development person or the peer calling to ask so-and-so to meet with them, it's always better to have the real person do it. They'll say no, and then you need to ask them, we'd really appreciate it if you'd meet with us. I don't have any time. Well, I mean, you know, we can do it in a month or two. Eliminate the problems, okay? That's the best advice. Some people will refuse to meet with you. Some people will agree. The most famous story that I've ever been involved with was one where the first phone call, a very top-level executive asked another top-level executive, I'd like to have lunch with you. The other guy said, I never eat lunch, hung up the phone. That process ended with a $15 million gift. Okay, so if they say no, come back to them in a few months. I'll get back to you. Okay. All right. Mr. Avila, you'll tell me when I can't talk anymore. I'll just keep answering questions for that. Yeah, okay. All right. So we're done? We're done. Okay. I'm sorry I didn't answer the other questions, and I thank you very, very much for attending this webinar. And good luck to you. In fact, I want to get down there. The last message I would have for you is, I'll get to it, is, good luck. Okay, I have time for questions?
You can ask one more question. I think you have a question at the top of the simple proof that the larger inventory has been very large, but it range and increments don't do that exactly what actually ask that question.
Oh, okay. All right, well, Caleb, I'll have to answer it another time. Thank you so much. Well, have a good day.